What does it look like to be deeply rooted in Christ in a world of cultural chaos? Welcome to the Equip Podcast. I'm Mark Vance, the lead pastor at Cornerstone Church of Ames, and each week we want to look at core biblical truths that will equip you to live a life of faithfulness, to be salt and light wherever Jesus has called you. Well, we're continuing on with a little bit of a discussion on what we do as we come to the end of life. So 60s, 70s, 80s in the winter, that final quarter before we go to glory. And I want to talk today about end of life and health, the final decades of life and health. Somebody said this phrase to me the other day. He said, Mark, I think 65 is the new 35. And I thought, what the world are you talking about? 65 is still 65, dude. Yes, people can live longer and healthier in a modern world, and we should bless the Lord for it. But no one actually gets to turn the clock back 3 decades. That's an illusion. We're lying to ourselves about that. I want to say at the outset of this, I am not a doctor, nor do I play one on podcasts. I am not giving you any specific medical advice. So do not hear anything I say on this podcast and deviate immediately through some sort of self-medication thing away from what a doctor would recommend. You need to talk to your physician before you implement anything. I'm not trying to act like your doctor. What I do think is we need to have some serious thought about what we do as we come to the end, because there is something changing in the sort of technologies that we have, not to sustain life, but to prolong death. I mentioned a quote in my sermon on this at Cornerstone. I was recently reading through a PubMed journal where they were talking about just what it looks like as people get older and the sort of medical interventions that we can do. And what the journal said is that we now have, because the technologies available to seriously delay our process of dying. I want you to think about what that really means. Okay, just for a second. What that means is we have medical technologies that in previous generations, you would have had a heart attack and died. But now we can implant a pacemaker, or we can put in a device that would shock your heart if it quit beating or beat way out of rhythm. You see, that person who died, therefore, didn't experience the decade of decline that congestive heart failure has in its final terminus. We didn't have in prior generations technologies where we would put people on dialysis for years to keep kidneys working that don't work. Okay, so you don't die of the kidney disease where you used to fall asleep and die within a week or two. So what we're doing there is we're spending radical amounts of money in the American health system right now to sustain a prolonged process of dying for wildly unhealthy people. I was talking recently to a friend who worked as a nurse on a heart floor. And I said, what's the difference now between when you first started? And their statement was instantaneous and very clear. They said, everyone is vastly more unhealthy today that I'm treating. And I said, so do you think American culture is more unhealthy? And they're like, no, Mark. These people, we can keep them alive longer while they're dying. That's brutal, guys. But not all medical technologies are enhancing life. Some of them are prolonging death. Okay, just be aware of that. And as a Christian, we need to think about this. Death is the ultimate enemy. We're to resist it. But there are certain types of treatment and care that I don't think they're resisting an enemy in any real way, because they're not moving us toward life. They're prolonging a suffering process in people. While that might prolong the technical years you add to your life, I don't think any of us think that's prolonging any of the quality of your life. We don't want to make the final years of life slow decline and suffering if it can be avoided. And so some of that has to do with how we think about medical treatments and end of life. So I'm going to give you 3 principles today that as a Christian, I think can inform you as you're thinking about these things. One is the principle that you have something under your control, which is the ability to stay healthy now. We'll talk about that one. Secondly, I'm going to suggest that you seriously consider changing your doctoring strategy based on your decade. And we'll get into what that means. And then thirdly, we're going to talk a little bit about how we do terminal illness and the importance of hospice and end-of-life palliative care. So 3 key terms. First off, 3 key items, rather. First off, stay healthy now. The best tool that you have at your disposal to try to extend the quality of life you have are the decisions you make. If you never work out, and if you are obese or severely overweight, if you have a form of diabetes where you are actually not controlling that appropriately through personal choices, you are rising the probability that your last decade of life will lower significantly in quality. The literal motivation I have going to the gym, I cannot control this, but I think it's wise. My motivation when I go to the gym is I'm trying to enhance the quality of my last decade of life. That's what I'm doing in my 40s, because work you do now enhances how you live then. A really interesting book was given to me. It's the book How to Make Disease Disappear by Rangan Chatterjee. And it's a terrible title because it gives you the illusion that he's a quack doctor trying to do weird stuff. What he's really talking about is the prevalence in the Western world of largely preventable diseases that we are dying from. The diseases that are largely around obesity, that are largely around lack of activity, preventable forms of diabetes, which are largely around what we eat and how we live. Heart disease that could be severely delayed if we simply were to improve how we ate and lived. And he gave 4 pillars for how to make diseases that are kind of catastrophic in the West, but largely preventable, disappear. Eat, move, relax, and sleep. And I'm going to add a 5th pillar, which is social. Let's walk those through. How you eat impacts how you will live. So generally speaking, we want to eat a diet that is full of quality proteins and colorful. Eating better is better. I'm not saying never have cake. I love cake. I just don't eat cake every day, and no one should. In the ancient world, sugar was a form of feasting. We consider it a daily obligation in life. No one in a pre-modern world thought you should have ice cream every day. That is a totally weird idea. So what you want to do in eating is eat good quality proteins, more colorful things, and then generally eat in a fasted way, quote unquote, 6 days a week, and then bless yourself in a feasting day on the 7th day of the week. What that means is don't eat dessert every day. You don't need to have blueberries or something. Don't eat weird. Okay, number 2, move. The older you get, the more you will lose muscle. So the target is not to walk endless laps. Too many people are walking too much and lifting too little. Lift weight as you get older. Relax. What that means is have some sort of fun hobby. I mentioned birding. I'm joking. You don't have to get into birding, but read a book, have golf, stay active in your forms of relaxation. Sleep is deeply important. And I realize the older you get, the harder it is to sleep. I get it. You're waking up I know. But whatever we want to do is create the environment that gives us the best opportunity to sleep well. But I'm going to add a 5th here, and I think this is very important. Social. The Bible is clear. It's not good for man to be alone. We need not just God, but relationships to others. One of the best indicators, by the way, of human longevity is a healthy marriage. People who are connected socially are more vibrant in their health. And so I think both a marriage, but also just in friendships, the healthier cultivation of friendships earlier in life will pay incredible dividends later in life. So I recommended Rangan Chatterjee's How to Make Disease Disappear. Super interesting. If you want even deeper dive, Peter Attia's book, Outlive, so interesting. And listen, guys, there are medical advances coming here that are going to help you, yes. GLP-1 drugs. I'm not going to comment completely on this. I'm not a doctor. Also not a doctor. And I don't love the idea that I can take a pill that short circuits hard work. But in general, if you told me that I was able to take something that would vastly lower some of the end of life indicators that would get people out of diabetic sort of function, I just think we need to be open to advances that prolong healthy living here. So principle one, if you want to do the best you can with end-of-life health, actually, there's a few things you can probably do that increase your odds of living healthier longer. We should do those things. Do those things. Number two, I'm going to advocate for having a different doctoring strategy based on different decades. You should change the approach you take to treatment and health based on the age you are. We don't need to be treating 45-year-olds with the onset of heart issues the same way that we treat 85-year-olds. They're different people. And so therefore, humans are not just static creatures. The way we treat an 85-year-old is different from the way we treat a 45-year-old. Now, why is this a thing I bring up? Because it's highly unlikely that your personal doctor is going to be deeply familiar with this. Part of it is just how they're trained in medicine. Recently, one of the largest geriatric programs in the country at University of Minnesota, which has an incredible medical program, the whole geriatric specialization, the specialization of medicine for older adults, was eliminated, like the whole department. This is not necessarily required coursework for most people in their medical training. And so what that will mean often is you go to see a standard physician. If you're 45 or 85 with blood pressure, they may have a tendency to treat you similarly without a consideration to your age. Many doctors, please understand, will change this and update this. But we don't have enough doctors trained in old people medicine in America. That's a real problem because of the aging of the baby boomer generation. We simply don't have doctors who are familiar with geriatric care at the numbers that we're going to need across the Western world. And so what I think you're going to need to do is change your strategy for how you think about doctoring. And you're going to need to have those honest conversations with your physician. If you are 80, you need to tell them, my goal is not to allow medicine to help me to die more slowly. My goal is to function at the healthiest way possible for the longest way possible. But I don't want to take a chronic and disabling disease and just stretch it out indefinitely. That's not my perspective. You need to identify certain forms of treatment that in your 40s you might easily move toward, that in your 80s you might not. I'm going to give you one example, just one example, and I just want this to be food for thought. My dad was diagnosed with congestive heart failure toward the end of his life. And because of the onset of his congestive heart failure, the weakness of his heart, it made him very susceptible to a heart attack, where if he had a heart attack in a certain place, it was very unlikely he was going to survive that cardiac arrest event because he was simply not healthy enough in his heart to do that. At certain points of the unhealth of the heart, there are medical procedures they can do to implant devices that would shock the heart back, right? You have pacemakers that kind of keep you in rhythm. You have others that would shock you if you fall out, or it's not fully a defibrillator, but it's that principle, all right? Those devices, I Googled the average medical age in which those are implanted and to the type of people in which those are implanted. You go 20 to 30 years ago, and almost no one over the age of 80 ever would have a device like that implanted. Today, estimates are 12 to 20% of all of those devices are implanted in people 80 years and over. So here's what that means. You are already on severe health decline, and you're going to shock your heart back in. Prior generations, those people whose heart quit, they passed. And you might say, oh, but Mark, I want a few more years. I don't know if as a Christian, we want a few more years of slow deterioration happening. I don't know that's better. I miss my dad terribly. It would have been incredibly profoundly selfish of me to say, Dad, I want to make sure that no matter what happens, we're always able to shock you back, no matter what. My dad was clear about who he was in Christ. And he is with the Lord in glory. I don't want to take that from him. He didn't want to slowly deteriorate and die. I'm not saying that you never implant that in a person 85 and over. I'm not a doctor. I am not a doctor. What I am saying is we do need to ask this question of ourselves if we're that person and that patient. Is this enhancing my life really, or is this prolonging my death? So change the way you doctor by decade. In your 40s, think seriously about health. 40s and 50s, you still have enough energy. As you get to your 60s, your 70s, but especially when we get in the 80s plus, there are certain types of treatment. You just need to look at your doctor and say, why do we need to do that now? That invasive medical procedure. I don't know that I want that. Be careful with this. Change your doctoring by your decade. So first one, stay healthy now. Secondly, doctoring by decade. Thirdly, let's talk about end of life and in particular, terminal illnesses. Cancer treatment cancer is just a word that we all react to. It's important to say different types of cancers have different types of treatment and therefore different types of approaches. Diagnostic testing for cancer being detected much, much earlier is getting so much better today than it used to be. And cancer treatments, as we understand the nature of cancer and have different treatments can affect it, have become so much better. And we should bless the Lord for that. But our terminologists say we always have to fight cancer. We've got to indefinitely do this, that make it feel as if there's a moral choice that a person has to make to be a warrior and fight. Everything at every level with every tool available. Blasting a person at the end of their life with unbelievably aggressive chemo when they're over 80 feels to me often, as I've watched it play out, just like a brutality added to what is already brutal in cancer. We need to be careful with that. Doctors will give you options, but as a family, I'm going to give a different type of option, and that is hospice and palliative care. Hospice care is not, so a lot of people have terrible ideas, and I hate when people say this, well, hospice is just what I do when I'm at the very, very last stages of dying. Not necessarily. Palliative care and hospice care is doctoring with a different aim as you come to the end of life. If you have a terminal diagnosis or you're very close to the end, what they're going to aim there for is not to do interventionist types of treatments to prolong life. Instead, they're going to aim at quality of life over longevity of life. And as we age, there are certain types of interventions that may not be as appropriate. And so sometimes as we look at a more terminal diagnosis, severe heart disease, cancers, some of those sorts of things, one thing that I think could help us is if we availed ourselves of saying, I'd love to have a conversation with a palliative care or hospice care sort of specialist. What those folks will do is help you understand the options you have. Some people think of, well, at hospice care, I cut off all treatment. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. What they're trying to do is maximize quality of life over length of life. And I think that way of thinking is something that as we age, we need to give careful consideration to. Is the goal ultimately of this treatment for a terminal illness to give me the maximum number of physical days this side of heaven? Well, as a Christian, now my life is hidden with Christ in God. That may not always be our goal, therefore. Instead, I want to suggest we want to have the maximum quality of days. Our treatment plan may be different in that scenario. So what we have is an opportunity in a modern world to look at some of the medical tools that we could use as Christians and prayerfully, carefully say, I don't know that that's the best choice. Death is an enemy, but there's nothing necessarily more godly or dignified about fighting all the way to the bitter end, increasing pain and suffering in that process and prolonging not life, but prolonging dying. That doesn't necessarily line up with a Christian worldview. Final word I'm going to say is this. What I am not saying, and what I deeply as a Christian want to push back on, is the whole death by choice movement, that euthanasia should be more popular. I was recently made aware, and you can Google this if you want to see it. It's heartbreaking. The stats on personal choice euthanasia in Canada. Canada recently legalized on a pretty broad basis, the usage of medications which can end a life. okay? It's called medical assistance in dying, and it was legalized in Canada in 2016. I'm just going to read you some of the stats here. You have to be at least 18 years old, eligible for health services, mentally capable, and have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, okay? You can't, that sort of thing. Track 1 is natural death. Track 2 is for people with chronic, painful, but non-terminal illnesses. They have a 90-day assessment period, and then they can prescribe medications that will literally allow you, through self-administration or clinical administration, to end your own life in assisted suicide. Often, people will call this dying with dignity. Friends, that's actually murder with dignity, and there's nothing dignified about taking one's own life. That's not within our control. The Lord numbers our days. Hospice care is about quality of life as we near to death. And while we are not trying to extend life indefinitely, we're trying to honor life in hospice care. That's vastly different from euthanasia, which is seeking to end life. You have no right to end life. That's God's decision. But you do have a right to think through the types of medical treatments that you believe it actually prolong true vitality in life, and you need to do that. We have technology now that will allow us to do things that, while they may be medically permissible, are somewhat inhumane. So friends, as you're aging, stay healthy now. All right, guys? We need to lift some weight, old people. And I'm talking to myself in that. We're going to move heavy stuff. We're going to eat good protein. We're going to do all that stuff. 2, we're going to have honest conversations with our doctor, with our friends, to think through how we can doctor differently by decade, in particular in the final decades. And then number 3, we're not going to be afraid of hospice care. These are brilliant people who have a medically great perspective on how to enhance not just days, but quality of life. And especially as we look at terminal illness, that where those diagnoses come, we need to engage that sort of palliative care earlier so that we get their perspective and their expertise, all the while honoring God's good gift of life and never taking that of our own accord. So I want you to start this conversation with your kids and your friends. The more we can talk about how to truly live, the better we'll be equipped to live and to die like Christians. Don't put off awkward conversations. Lean into this space. And so my hope is this podcast will just stir that up so that as Christians, as we look at those final days we have before we see the Lord, we live with wisdom, with grace, and with dignity.